So there was a recent study out of Stanford, actually, that talked about this in a little bit different way, that it's more genetically based, but in Stanford, in the study within the last couple months, they actually have said environmental may be an even bigger role than what we thought. And I'm going to go through the Bonnie Forrest model of sort of where I think the research is at, trying to integrate all of this in a little bit. Again, I don't think anybody's talked about it this way in the literature yet, but I want to sort of try to frame and reference, because I think it's important to be able to talk about these things with parents. And sort of the biggest questions you'll get are, why is there such an increase? And so we can talk about how people answer that as a group. And then the other one is sort of, is this genetic or is it environmental? Those are the two biggest questions that I get. 10% of children with ASD have an identifiable genetic, neurologic, or metabolic disorder such as Fragile X or Down. And in 2009, 30 to 51% of the children who had an ASD also had an intellectual disability. Okay, so 41% on average means they have an IQ under 70. Okay. We can talk about later on. I had a friend when I was at Yale who did a lot of work with a lighter. I don't love it. And I can talk about why I don't. That's a personal preference. Okay, has anybody else worked with a lighter here? You have? Okay, we'll talk about that. It's very big. You'll often find parents coming in and requesting it to be used. And there's pluses and minuses of it. About 40% of children with an ASD don't talk at all. Okay? Those are the kids who tend to do less well over time in interventions. 30% of children with autism has some words at 12 to 18 months and then lose them. Now this one is a hard one to tease out, because when you're talking to parents, a lot of the time they don't recall, or you'll find the more you poke around with it, or if you get the baby book in, that they really never had language. So this one's a harder one to tease out, which is part of the reason I think they're getting rid of the diagnosis of child disintegrative disorder. Now, very important differential to make. In San Diego, if you have an autism diagnosis, it's very hard to get an EEG, but I still am old school. I still like to get an, especially if there was a report of language loss, I still like to get an EEG. Why do I like to get an EEG? What rule out? Landau-Kleffner syndrome. Landau-Kleffner syndrome and child disintegrative disorder can look a lot alike. And seizures can be very hard to detect. So you could have a loss of language and Landau-Kleffner syndrome, or ESES, which is slow wave and spike syndrome, and epilepsy. Each of those two can be an issue. So I really love to work with a good neurologist. They are so overwhelmed in San Diego, the neurologists are, that they don't do EEGs here. For a child with an autism diagnosis if they don't have other things to suspect epilepsy. Research has shown that a diagnosis of autism at age 2 can be reliable, valid, and stable. At 2, I feel very comfortable these days. You can go down to 1. There's been some great work by Eric Corshane's groups and Karen Pierce's group out of UCSD. They released an article within the last 6 months on a test that you can use to screen down to age 1, which I think is really good, really, really good. The issue becomes, once you screen, how do you test a 1-year-old? It gets really hard. The 1 to 2 age range, I'm still not in love with any of the tests out there.